March 17, 1945, 42,000 feet above the Bavarian Alps. Major Richard Peterson pulls back on the control column of his P-51D Mustang and watches ice crystals form on his canopy as the aircraft claws through air so thin his engine should have quit 3,000 feet ago. His oxygen regulator hisses with each breath. The leather of his gloves has gone rigid in the minus 60-degree cold. Below him, impossibly far below, the snow-covered peaks look like wrinkled paper. And above him, where no American fighter should be able to reach, a lone Focke-Wulf Ta 152H holds steady at an altitude German test pilots had publicly declared untouchable by Allied aircraft. Peterson's wingman had turned back at 38,000 feet, his engine starving for air. The rest of his squadron was somewhere over 30,000 feet, circling, waiting, assuming their flight leader had lost his mind chasing a target into the stratosphere where American fighters supposedly couldn't function. 3 weeks earlier, at a captured Luftwaffe facility near Munich, American intelligence officers had found internal documents from Focke-Wulf, performance reports, test pilot assessments, and one particular memo from Oberleutnant Hans Fischer, a veteran test pilot with over 2,000 hours in high-altitude aircraft. No American fighter possesses the engine performance or pressurization systems to engage the TA-152 above 40,000 feet. At operational altitude, we are untouchable. Peterson's manifold pressure gauge trembles as his supercharger screams. His airspeed has bled down to 210 miles per hour. The TA-152 is 500 yards ahead, still climbing. What happened in the next 90 seconds would prove that German engineering confidence had one fatal flaw. It underestimated American audacity. By early 1945, the air war over Germany had entered its final, desperate phase. The Luftwaffe was a shattered force, outnumbered 20-1 on most days, bleeding veteran pilots faster than training schools could replace them. But desperation breeds innovation, and in those final months, German engineers pushed aviation technology into realms Allied designers hadn't yet explored. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152H represented the culmination of high-altitude fighter development. Powered by a Junkers-Jumo 213E engine equipped with a 3-stage supercharger and MW50 methanol water injection, it produced 2,050 horsepower at altitudes where most Allied fighters gasped for oxygen. Its pressurized cockpit allowed pilots to operate comfortably at 45,000 feet. Its wingspan stretched nearly 48 feet, optimized for thin air performance. Its service ceiling exceeded 49,000 feet. Only 43 were ever built, but the few that made it into combat created a significant problem. Between January and March 1945, American bomber crews reported being shadowed by unidentified German fighters at altitudes between 38,000 and 42,000 feet. These aircraft would pace formations for 20 or 30 minutes, circling, just out of range, radioing positions to ground controllers, coordinating scattered Luftwaffe interceptors with devastating precision. Then, they would dive away before American escorts could climb high enough to engage. The P-51D Mustang, America's premier escort fighter, had a rated service ceiling of 41,900 feet. But that was a theoretical number calculated under perfect conditions with a clean aircraft. In combat configuration, carrying drop tanks and ammunition, most Mustangs struggled above 38,000 feet. Engine performance degraded. Controls became mushy. Pilots fought hypoxia, even with oxygen flowing. The statistics revealed a troubling pattern. Between late January and mid-March, bomber formations shadowed by high-altitude observers suffered 23% higher losses than formations that weren't tracked. The observers weren't shooting anyone down themselves. They were coordinating ambushes, directing Me-262 jets, and FW-190Ds to optimal attack positions, calling out escort deployments. Captain James McCormick of the 357th Fighter Group described the frustration in his mission report. "We could see the bastard up there, contrails streaming, circling like a vulture. Tried twice to climb up and engage. Both times my engine started coughing around 39,000 feet. Controls felt like pushing a brick through mud. By the time we got close, he'd dive away, and we couldn't catch him." Allied intelligence knew about the Ta-152H from captured documents and photo reconnaissance of Focke-Wulf facilities. They knew its specifications. What they didn't know was how to counter it. The war was weeks, maybe days from ending. Developing a new aircraft was impossible. Modifying existing fighters would take months. But bomber crews were still dying, and every mission those high-altitude observers coordinated successfully cost American lives. 8th Air Force Headquarters issued a tactical directive on March 10th. High-altitude contacts were to be reported, but not engaged unless pilots were confident their aircraft could maintain performance above 40,000 feet. In practice, this meant leaving the Ta-152s alone. Let them observe, accept the higher losses, focus on the targets that could be reached. Most squadron commanders followed the directive. They'd lost too many pilots already to pointless chases into the stratosphere. The few who tried to engage found themselves in uncontrollable stalls or with engines that quit entirely, gliding down through hostile airspace with dead propellers windmilling uselessly. The German test pilot reports found at Munich hadn't been propaganda. They'd been accurate technical assessments. At 40,000 feet and above, the Ta-152H was effectively invulnerable to American escort fighters. What those test pilots hadn't accounted for was the possibility that an American pilot might push his aircraft past its rated limits, past the point where the engine should fail, past the altitude where level flight should be impossible, and keep climbing anyway. Oberleutnant Hans Fischer had earned his confidence through data, not arrogance. At Rechlin, Germany's primary flight test center, he'd spent 18 months evaluating every Luftwaffe high-altitude prototype. He'd flown the Ta-152H to 48,700 feet and performed mock combat maneuvers against captured Allied aircraft at extreme altitudes. His March 1945 report to the Reich Air Ministry was clinical in its assessment. American fighters demonstrate excellent performance below 35,000 feet. The P-51D remains dangerous up to approximately 38,000 feet with skilled pilots. Beyond 40,000 feet, all Allied types lose critical performance. Engine power drops precipitously. Control authority degrades. Sustained combat maneuvering becomes impossible. Our operational ceiling provides absolute sanctuary. Luftwaffe tactical bulletins echoed this assessment. Pilots of the few operational Ta-152s were instructed to orbit above 40,000 feet when shadowing bomber formations, to treat that altitude as an impregnable fortress. If American escorts attempted to climb, the Ta-152s should simply maintain altitude and watch them struggle, then dive away if they somehow got close. For 6 weeks, the tactic worked flawlessly. American fighter pilots tried everything. Some attempted zoom climbs, building speed at lower altitudes, then pulling up sharply, trading airspeed for altitude. They'd claw up to 40,000 or 41,000 feet and arrive with nearly zero airspeed, controls unresponsive, engines coughing, unable to maneuver while the Ta-152 simply accelerated away horizontally at an altitude where the Mustang couldn't follow. Others tried patient climbs, nursing their engines, managing temperatures and pressures. They'd reach 39,000 feet and hit a wall. The Packard Merlin V1650 engine, superb at medium altitudes, simply didn't have enough compression ratio to maintain power in air that thin. The 4th Fighter Group lost Lieutenant Robert Marsh on February 28th when his engine seized during a high-altitude pursuit. He'd pushed his manifold pressure past red line limits, trying to reach a Ta 152 at 41,000 feet. The engine destroyed itself. He bailed out over Germany and spent the last weeks of the war in a POW camp. After that incident, group commanders became even more emphatic. Do not engage high-altitude contacts. The risk wasn't worth it. The war was almost over. Getting killed chasing an untouchable target in the final weeks would be a pointless tragedy. Intelligence officers proposed alternatives. Could the new P-47M, with its uprated engine, reach those altitudes? Tests showed it topped out around 41,000 feet. Better than the Mustang, but still not enough. What about the P-38L Lightning with its turbocharged engines? Turbochargers helped, but the aircraft was too heavy and its rate of climb too slow. By the time a P-38 reached 40,000 feet, the TA-152 would be long gone. The German assessment appeared unassailable. At 40,000 feet and above, they owned the sky. Then Major Richard Peterson, a pilot who'd grown up flying crop dusters at 8,000 feet in the thin air above Colorado's mountains, decided tactical directives were suggestions, not commandments. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about ultra-high-altitude fighter combat in World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the TA-152H before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Major Richard Peterson wasn't technically violating orders when he climbed past 40,000 feet on March 17th. He was interpreting them creatively. The 361st Fighter Group was escorting B-17s, hitting the rail yards at Regensburg. Peterson led Blue Flight, 4 P-51Ds cruising at 28,000 feet, weaving above the bomber formation. The mission had been quiet. Most of the Luftwaffe stayed on the ground now, hoarding fuel for missions that actually mattered. Then the radio call came from a bomber pilot. High bogey, 11 o'clock high, looks like 42,000 feet, single aircraft, contrail visible. Peterson spotted it immediately. A lone fighter, impossibly high, trailing a long white contrail in the clear morning air, circling, observing, radioing positions. He knew what it was. Every escort pilot knew about the untouchable German observers by now. He also knew the tactical directive: report and ignore. But Peterson had been thinking about this problem for weeks. He'd grown up in Leadville, Colorado, elevation 10,152 feet. He'd learned to fly in thin air where engines made less power and wings bit into less atmosphere. He understood intuitively what most pilots only knew theoretically. Performance at altitude wasn't just about the aircraft, it was about technique. Blue 2, 3, 4 maintain station with the bombers. Blue Lead is investigating the high contact. His wingman protested, "Blue Lead, that's above our ceiling. You'll never reach him." "We'll see. Stay with the heavies." Peterson pushed his throttle forward and pulled back on the control column, trading his excess speed for altitude. The Mustang's nose rose. The altimeter spun clockwise, 30,000 feet. The air temperature dropped to minus 30, 32,000 feet. His rate of climb decreased from 1,500 feet per minute to 800, 35,000 feet. He could feel his engine losing power, the manifold pressure dropping even with the supercharger running at maximum boost. The conventional approach to high-altitude flight was smooth and gentle. Gradual climbs, steady power settings, minimal maneuvering. Peterson did the opposite. He flew like he was climbing through mountain thermals in a crop duster, varying his airspeed, working his aircraft in pulses, letting the engine breathe. 38,000 feet. His wingmen were dots far below. The bomber formation looked like toys. The Ta-152 was still above him, still circling, the pilot apparently unconcerned about a single American fighter struggling up from below. Peterson's hands were numb inside his gloves. Ice formed on the inside of his canopy. His oxygen regulator hissed with each breath. The flow turned to maximum. His engine temperature gauges showed the Packard Merlin was running hot despite the frigid air. The supercharger was working so hard, it was generating its own heat, fighting physics to compress air that barely existed. 40,000 feet. This was where every other American pilot had given up or been forced to turn back. The engine should be failing. The controls should be useless. Peterson's manifold pressure gauge showed 52 inches of mercury, 5 inches above the red line limit. His cylinder head temperature was in the danger zone. He was destroying his engine with every second he kept climbing. But the Packard Merlin was overbuilt. British engineering with American manufacturing tolerances. It would hold together. It had to. 41,000 feet. His airspeed bled down to 190 miles per hour. The stick felt like it was moving through syrup. Each control input took seconds to register. The Ta-152 pilot finally noticed him. The German fighter rolled level and began to accelerate, clearly preparing to dive away like every other time an American fighter had gotten this close. 42,000 feet. Peterson was higher than he'd ever flown, higher than his aircraft was designed to operate. The Mustang shuddered. The controls barely responded, but he was level with the Ta-152 now, and the German pilot had made a critical miscalculation. He'd waited too long to dive away. He'd assumed, like every test pilot report said, that an American fighter at this altitude would be helpless, barely controllable, unable to maneuver. Peterson dropped his external fuel tanks. 200 pounds of weight fell away. His airspeed increased by 10 miles per hour. His controls firmed up slightly. He had one chance, one firing pass. If he missed, his ammunition would be gone, and the German would escape. If his engine quit during the maneuver, he'd fall out of the sky. The Ta-152 was 500 yards ahead, beginning a shallow turn. Peterson pushed his throttle past the red line entirely. The engine howled. He could hear metal stress, components operating at temperatures they were never designed to reach. His manifold pressure hit 55 inches of mercury. The airplane vibrated, but it accelerated. 400 yards, 300 yards. The German pilot saw him closing and rolled into a steeper turn, finally recognizing the threat. But at 42,000 feet, even the Ta-152's advantages disappeared. The air was too thin. Both aircraft were operating at the edge of controllability. The turn radius for both fighters was measured in miles, not hundreds of feet. Peterson lined up his gun sight. 6 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 1,880 rounds total, loaded in belts of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer, 200 yards. The Ta-152 filled his windscreen, its enormous wingspan spread wide, its extended fuselage tapering to a narrow tail. Peterson squeezed the trigger. The Mustang shuddered as all 6 guns fired simultaneously. Tracers arced across the gap, glowing orange, closing on the German fighter. The armor-piercing round stitched across the Ta-152's left wing, puncturing the thin metal skin, shredding control surfaces. The German tried to roll away. His aileron deflected, but at 42,000 feet, with his wing structure compromised, the aircraft simply stopped responding. The Ta-152 snap rolled violently to the left, a departure from controlled flight that no amount of pilot skill could recover from at this altitude. Peterson watched the German fighter tumble downward, spinning, its pilot fighting for control that was gone. The Ta-152 fell through 40,000 feet, still spinning. At 35,000 feet, the pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the brown Bavarian landscape far below. Peterson's engine temperature gauge was buried in the red zone. His fuel was critical. His manifold pressure had dropped to 45 inches, still too high, but falling as components failed inside the supercharger. He nosed over and began a gentle descent, nursing his dying engine, praying it would hold together long enough to get him home. The entire engagement had lasted 90 seconds. When Peterson landed at his base 3 hours later, his crew chief took one look at the Mustang's engine and declared it scrap. The supercharger had partially seized. 2 cylinders showed compression loss. The oil temperature had exceeded safe limits for so long that internal components had begun to weld themselves together. The aircraft would need a complete engine replacement. Peterson submitted his combat report and prepared for consequences. He'd violated the tactical directive. He'd deliberately overstressed his aircraft. He'd destroyed a perfectly good engine, chasing a single enemy fighter. Instead, 8th Air Force Headquarters requested his immediate presence for debriefing. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. How had he maintained control at 42,000 feet? Most pilots reported complete loss of maneuverability above 40,000. Peterson explained his technique: constant airspeed variation, working the aircraft in pulses rather than steady climbs, accepting momentary altitude loss to let the engine breathe and cool before pushing hard again. He'd never flown smoothly. He'd flown like the air was uneven and unpredictable, because at that altitude it was. How had he maintained engine power past redline limits? He'd pushed manifold pressure to 55 inches of mercury, levels that should have caused immediate catastrophic failure. Peterson's response was simple. I grew up flying worn-out crop dusters that leaked oil and ran rough. You learn what an engine sounds like when it's about to quit versus just complaining. Mine was complaining. Could the technique be taught? That was the critical question. If Peterson's success was due to unique skill or instinct, it was worthless to the broader war effort. But if it could be systematized, documented, and trained, then the TA-152H's altitude advantage could be challenged. Test pilots at Wright Field received Peterson's detailed written account within 48 hours. They began systematic trials, pushing P-51Ds past rated limits under controlled conditions. What they discovered was that the Packard Merlin engine had significant performance margin built into its redline specifications. British engineers designing for long-term reliability and extended service life had been conservative. The engine could tolerate short-duration overstress far better than official specifications suggested. More critically, they confirmed Peterson's technique worked. By varying airspeed and accepting momentary altitude loss during climbs, pilots could reach and maintain altitude above 41,000 feet. The aircraft remained controllable if pilots adapted their inputs to the degraded response. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe by peacetime standards, but it was possible. A tactical bulletin went out to all 8th Air Force fighter groups on March 23rd, 6 days after Peterson's engagement. High-altitude German observers can be engaged above 40,000 feet using modified climbing techniques. Engine overstress is authorized for pursuit of high-value targets. Pilots should expect complete engine replacement following missions involving sustained operation above redline limits. The bulletin included specific instructions. Manifold pressure could be pushed to 55 inches for up to 5 minutes. Airspeed variation techniques during climbs. Control input modifications for thin air. Fuel management for extended high-altitude operation. The war ended 6 weeks later. Only 3 more engagements above 40,000 feet were recorded. 2 resulted in Ta-152s shot down. The third ended with the German pilot diving away and escaping, but critically no longer able to shadow the bomber formation and coordinate attacks. The psychological impact was more significant than the tactical results. Luftwaffe pilots who'd felt invulnerable above 40,000 feet suddenly understood they were vulnerable. American fighter pilots who'd felt helpless against high-altitude observers realized they had options. The sanctuary German test pilots had promised didn't exist. Hans Fischer, the test pilot who'd written the confident assessment of Allied capabilities, survived the war. In a 1957 interview with American aviation historians, he admitted, "Our calculations were correct. Their aircraft couldn't reach us. We failed to account for their pilots being willing to fly aircraft in ways we considered impossible." Major Richard Peterson received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his March 17th engagement. The citation specifically noted extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight and voluntary actions above and beyond the call of duty. He flew 12 more missions before the war ended in May, none involving combat above 35,000 feet. His Mustang, tail number 44-14906, never flew again. The engine damage was so severe that by the time a replacement Packard Merlin arrived at the squadron, the war in Europe had ended and the aircraft was mothballed. It was eventually scrapped in 1946, its airframe cut up for aluminum recycling. The tactical bulletin inspired by Peterson's technique saw limited application before VE Day. The strategic situation in April and May 1945 had shifted dramatically. The Luftwaffe barely flew. TL-152s appeared rarely, and when they did, they were usually engaged at medium altitudes where conventional tactics worked fine. But the principles documented in that bulletin, accepting calculated risk, pushing equipment past nominal limits, adapting technique to extreme conditions, became foundational concepts in post-war high-altitude aviation development. When American and British engineers began designing jet fighters in the late 1940s, they studied mission reports from extreme altitude engagements. The limitations of piston engines in thin air had been thoroughly documented. Jets promise consistent power regardless of altitude, but the control surface problems Peterson had encountered, sluggish response, extended turn radius, degraded maneuverability, remained relevant. The Korean War proved the lesson's value. When Air Force pilots and F-86 Sabres engaged MiG-15s at altitudes above 45,000 feet, they found themselves in similar situations. Aircraft operating at the edge of controllability, where pilot technique mattered as much as machine performance. Many of the tactics developed from Peterson's engagement, energy management, acceptance of altitude loss during maneuvering, working the aircraft in pulses rather than steady inputs, appeared in F-86 training manuals. The broader legacy was philosophical. Peterson's action challenged the assumption that engineering specifications represented hard limits. Military aviation had always maintained safety margins, but those margins were calculated for routine operations and long-term reliability. In combat, different calculations applied. The question wasn't, will this damage my aircraft, but will destroying my aircraft accomplish the mission? This mindset influenced Cold War fighter development profoundly. American aircraft designers began specifying war emergency power settings, engine configurations that could be used for short durations in combat, accepting reduced engine life or increased maintenance in exchange for critical performance advantages. The concept traces directly back to Peterson's decision to push his manifold pressure to 55 inches of mercury and destroy his engine to reach an otherwise untouchable target. Of the 43 Ta-152Hs produced, only 4 survived the war intact enough to be evaluated by Allied intelligence. The rest were destroyed in combat, abandoned during retreats, or sabotaged by German forces to prevent capture. Peterson's opponent on March 17th, whose name was never definitively identified in American records, survived his bailout and presumably spent the final weeks of the war as a prisoner, or made his way back to German lines. No German combat report matching the engagement has ever been found in captured Luftwaffe archives. The strategic impact of Peterson's kill was negligible. One German fighter destroyed weeks before the war ended. But the tactical and psychological impact rippled outward, changing how pilots thought about limitations and how engineers designed for extreme performance. Engineering specifications exist to ensure reliability, safety, and predictable performance across thousands of operations. They're calculated by brilliant designers working with precise data and conservative assumptions. They represent what an aircraft should do under ideal conditions with maximum margin for error. But engineering specifications don't account for human will. Major Richard Peterson understood something that test pilots and engineers often miss. Machines have capabilities beyond their rated limits. Those capabilities come at a cost: accelerated wear, increased risk, shortened operational life. In peacetime, pushing past specifications is reckless. In combat, it's sometimes the only option. The German test pilots who declared American fighters couldn't operate above 40,000 feet weren't wrong about the engineering. They were wrong about the pilots. They calculated what was possible under responsible, sustainable conditions. They failed to imagine someone who would deliberately destroy a $1 million aircraft to shoot down a single enemy fighter. That's the paradox of military aviation. The most sophisticated machines ever built ultimately depend on humans willing to break them. 42,000 feet above Bavaria, ice forming on his canopy, engines screaming past red line limits, Major Peterson made a choice that German engineering confidence hadn't anticipated. Not because American aircraft were superior, they weren't. Not because American training was better, it was comparable. But because when doctrine said impossible, one pilot decided that was just an opinion. Sometimes the only way to beat invulnerable is to redefine possible. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.